such an amazing student.
Yep. Good morning. Sorry.
And there were things that
You were having a good time, and I've ruined it already. It may not be the only time today. I want to welcome you all. I'm Robert Strassfeld. I am a member of the law faculty here, and I am also the director of the Institute for Global Security, Law, and Policy, which is the sponsor of this conference. And as director, one of my privileges is I get to talk to the still largely empty room, which may be good given the prep time in my comments. I wrestled with whether to invoke Randolph Bowen or Lisa Birnbach in opening this conference. And I hope it doesn't do irreparable damage to my academic reputation that I chose Lisa Birnbach, the author of that 1980s classic, The Official Preppy Handbook, who subtitled the book, well, to misappropriate her subtitle, "Look, Muffy, a Conference for Us." And I guess the question is it self-absorption or even narcissism, something that, of course, never appears in academia, to focus on academia? Certainly, the impact of the 9/11 attacks and the reaction to them has been far greater in other settings. There have, to be sure, been consequences within the academy. There have been instances of attacks on academic freedom, most notoriously the Ward Churchill case, but also attacks on scholars of Middle Eastern studies. But for those of you who are familiar with the history retold in Ellen Schrecker's book, No Ivory Tower, certainly the experience of the Cold War has not been paralleled during the last 10 years. We, like most universities, with an increasing number of international students, had students from the Middle East who were interviewed by the FBI in the aftermath of 9/11. There have certainly been issues for universities who have sought to bring foreign scholars and had visa problems with foreign scholars, with foreign students, sometimes the problems emanating on this side of the ocean. In other instances, for example, Palestinian students who couldn't get travel documents to come to the United States, the problem coming from the other side. This university had to cancel a Latin American history course when a member of the history department was denied re-entry into the country after engaging in a summer of obviously revolutionary subversive activity of archival research in Central America, before the government could finally be persuaded that she posed no danger to the homeland. Nevertheless, these indignities, and sometimes more than indignities, lost jobs, and inconveniences pale in comparison to the impact of the last 10 years on all sorts of other people, be they Pakistanis who live in fear that because of the neighborhood they live in, a drone attack may greet them in the morning, to Iraqis, to detainees held in places from Bagram to Guantanamo to Lord only knows where. So then why a conference about us, given the many, many things one could talk about after 9/11? Well, perhaps it is that we are absorbed. But I also think that what we do matters, and that academics in general believe that what happens at universities matter, and that therefore this is something that is worth talking about. Universities are important, and therefore are worth consideration. Many of us do engage in a variety of ways with the national security state, whether as producers of knowledge for its purposes, or critics of what it does, or both. Academia has long been a center and a safe harbor for criticism. The teach-ins early in the movement against the war in Vietnam, for example, is not the only location of anti-war sentiment in the mid-1960s, but certainly an important place where those sentiments could be expressed and nourished until a vibrant anti-war movement developed. One can easily find other examples. The movement among Belgian students against further colonial rule in the Congo under the banner of not a drop of blood for empire. Now, universities face all sorts of challenges, and many of which have nothing to do with the national security state and 9/11, or perhaps, as we'll learn later, there are connections there. So we have to consider the context of those challenges as well. If indeed an important role for academics is to be the Jeremiahs, the Scolds of the nation, as our faculties are increasingly populated with contingent laborers who are overworked and unprotected by tenure, will that function disappear from the academy? Will the role of critic wither? So I think it is appropriate for us to talk about ourselves for a change. And we're going to do that in a series of panels. They can speak for themselves largely. I will just tell you very quickly that our first panel will look at the Cold War University. The literature on the Cold War was, in fact, the inspiration for this conference. There is considerable writing on the Cold War University. We know that the Cold War represented both an opportunity and a challenge for universities. Money flowed into universities. We are the places that we are today because of funding. But money flowed in often to sponsor certain kinds of research in preference to other kinds of research. The story is much more complicated than that, and I'm not sure that's what our panelists will talk about, but I think they will probably touch on that. As I said, we produce knowledge, both practical knowledge and stridently impractical knowledge. I mostly do the latter. And some of that is for the national security state or in the interest of national security. And that raises complex, difficult issues of ethics, ethics of our disciplines. The examples are numerous, obviously, from the atomic bomb project to the development of radar, to the use of the police studies program at Michigan State University to train the internal security forces of the Diem regime in Vietnam. It goes on and on. Those engagements can be productive and useful, and in other instances have been harmful. Our second panel will look at a specific instance of that, the use of anthropologists and other social scientists in Afghanistan and Iraq, and more generally in the development of counterinsurgency doctrine and the issues that emerge from that. This is a law school, and at the heart of many of the battles over national security and what's the appropriate response to 9/11 has been the law. And legal academics have played a major role in that. Again, both as facilitators for the development of policy as well as critics. Legal academics have framed the justifications, the legal justifications for the war in Iraq, have written the torture memos and justification as well for warrantless eavesdropping on Americans. But they have also played the role of counselors for detainees. And all of them have then brought back into the academy the experiences, the learning from those roles. And our third panel will look at the legal academy. And our reach is global. And our last panel will look outward, beyond the boundaries of American institutions. And we'll talk about the devastating impact of the Iraq wars on higher education in Iraq, the relationship between Americans, the discipline of American studies and notions of empire, and maybe hopefully at the possibilities of peace studies. It is my time, it's past my time to get out of the way. I have one thing that I need to mention to you. We are being webcast. And because of that, there are microphones for your questions. When we come to Q&A, please come down to the microphone so all of those people in internet land will be able to hear your question.
Bob, are we being webcast to the Pentagon?
Well, the question is, do they take us seriously or not? I don't know. Finally, it is gloomy and dismal and rainy outside. It is warm, and there will be illumination here inside. So please sit back and enjoy.
Good morning. Welcome to panel number one, as I understand it. Lessons of the Cold War University. My name is Ted Steinberg, and I'm from the history department here at Case Western, and I'm the moderator this morning. I should just say, apropos of the title of this panel, that I'm not a big fan myself of the lessons of history approach to the past. But if somebody, I suppose an undergraduate, asked me what are the lessons of the Cold War University, I guess I could come up with two. Maybe I could come up with three, but I'll tell you two. I think the first one's pretty obvious, and maybe the second one is too. But the first one is, if you're planning on becoming a university professor, don't join any secret organizations. That would be number one, I think. But number two, I think, is a perhaps more sobering and serious one, and that is never underestimate the creativity of academic administrators during either cold or times of cold or hot war, for that matter. And I have in mind here the what was called, as I understand it, the obligation of candor that was deployed during the 1950s to persecute academics, faculty members at various universities who were simply using, or I should say, launching a kind of moral objection to the idea of naming names before congressional committees. Now, I'm not sure that the panelists that you're going to hear from this morning, and who I will introduce in just a second, are going to speak to these issues, in large part because they're, frankly, I think, part of common knowledge at this point. What they are going to talk about, if I understand correctly, is the way in which the Cold War structured the production of knowledge here in the university. So without any further delay, let me just introduce our guests here, and
I sent you the introduction.
I'll get out of the way. Our first speaker is Rande Kostal of the School of Law at the University of Western Ontario. He's writing about the legal reconstruction of post-war Germany and Japan and the role of legal academics in this process. Our second speaker this morning is Mark Solovey of the University of Toronto, who's written about Project Camelot and is an expert on the relationship between the Cold War and social sciences. And our third speaker this morning will be Ronald Doel of the University of Florida, whose expertise is in the area of the Cold War and the geophysical sciences. I'm going to allow each of the members of the panel to talk for about 15 minutes. And I'll give them a chance briefly to respond to one another if they like, and then the rest of the balance of the time we can have a discussion regarding these issues. So, Randy, if you want to come up.
Thank you, Ted.
I might sit down here.
Thank you, Ted, and good morning. And Ted, nor am I a big fan of the lessons of history school, but when I was invited, Bob said I had to deliver a lesson. And so I sat down and thought, I really think I have one. I didn't know that before I started thinking about my remarks today. But as was mentioned, I'm a historian of American nation building and democratization projects in post-war Germany and Japan, and has been especially interested in the role of legal intellectuals, experts, and academics in the so-called legal democratization of Germany and Japan. And back when I began this work in roughly 2007, I was struck by how often then American officials, officials of state, in the context of defending what was going on in Iraq and the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, we're making all sorts of claims about how successful, what a sterling record the United States had in nation building and in democratization. And they not infrequently would point to the alleged record of the United States in Germany and Japan after the war. After all, didn't we successfully achieve democratization and liberalization of those authoritarian regimes, and therefore lending credibility to the claim that they could do it again? Well, I think that those kinds of claims, I have thought, they needed testing against the recovery of that historical record, and that's what I've set out to do. And in the context of today, in the context of my historical work today, it occurred to me to ask a question I thought would be apropos. And that question is as follows: can the independent, critical scholar work effectively and ethically within a government agency, especially one like American military government in post-war Germany, one dedicated to advancing a national security program? Can a scholar work ethically and effectively within such an organization? And I want to tell you now, I'm very much a pessimist about this. I think the answer is that by his or her nature as an idealist about truth and its utility, the critical scholar, the true scholar, cannot operate effectively and ethically within a government agency, one especially directed to security concerns. This certainly seems to be the moral of my historical anecdote, and I only have time to talk about one fragment of my empirical record. It seems to be the moral of my historical anecdote, the story of one academic, the German-born, trained, but naturalized American citizen and political scientist, Carl Lowenstein, and his experience as the senior expert consultant to one U.S. government organization, the Berlin-based legal division of American military government in occupied Nazi Germany. An arm, I think, we should understand that he was working for an arm of the emergent American national security state in post-war Europe. And this relationship with Lowenstein, this eminent scholar who willingly went to Germany, I will say again at the outset, this relationship he had with legal division of military government was marked by cross purposes, and at the end of the day, it's marked by its abject failure as a relationship. And I want to canvass the reasons for that failure. But also it strikes me just now in the context of 2011, just how naive, when I look at the historical record of Lowenstein and his involvement, just how naive Lowenstein was. He's a highly sophisticated man, but how naive he was when he decided to go to Germany, return to his homeland, and engage in these democratization and denazification projects. He really believed that his knowledge would make a difference. He really believed that it might even be decisive in the formation and implementation of policy. And as puzzling as that is, in retrospect, as puzzling as that naivete was, even innocence was, it's hard to believe that a man like Lowenstein was hired in the first place by the men who did, and that they thought it would all work. There is this beautiful innocence about this. And I think it's characteristic of sort of, I would call that characterizes the general immaturity of the U.S. as a superpower in 1945. It lacked anything like a large and experienced quasi-imperial administrative class. American nation builders in post-war Germany and Japan, but I'm going to talk about Germany only, were very much the accidental tourists. So something first now about the U.S. mission in Germany. What were they there to do? In its central and defining purpose, this was agreed upon at Tehran, at Yalta, at Potsdam, the central and defining purpose of the American mission and the Allied mission in Germany was, in the course of a comprehensive military occupation, to permanently neutralize the ability of the German people and German state to make war. In other words, the central mission of American military government was straightforwardly about security, national security. This raises an important point. What made the mission in Germany interesting to intellectuals like Lowenstein was not the mission, the national security mission itself, so much as the means by which the American state originally chose to achieve the mission. All right? The program was as follows. What we're going to do is we're going to take German guns away. We're going to take their guns away. That's not what interested Lowenstein in going to Germany, though. Then what we're going to do is Germany was going to be denazified. And it was supposed that there were both moral and political imperatives associated with the initial denazification of the German ruling class and its domestic legal and political institutions. Secondly, this is what Lowenstein thought what the means of the mission were. Secondly, once the vestiges of Nazism were removed, liberal democratic institutions were to be put in their place. In an outset of the project, both the leading experts like Lowenstein and administrators in Germany, both of them believed, and this again speaks to their naivete, I think, that the means of achieving the demilitarization mission were as important and indispensable as the ends, as the security ends. Of course, we now know, just as American experts in Afghanistan today must know, if there are such people, like Lowenstein in Afghanistan today, which, by the way, I very much doubt. But what we now know is that this is flatly untrue. The means aren't as important as the ends. The ends of one or another view of national security will always be trumps of the means of achieving that security, like denazification and democratization. The first is a fixed goal. The second is only desirable, but ultimately is dispensable. Now, finally, to my anecdote about Karl Lowenstein. Lowenstein was in 1945, when he went back to Germany, he was professor at Amherst and the chair of politics and jurisprudence. He had been born in Bavaria in 1891. He was the son of assimilated German Jews. He was educated at Munich and at Paris, and especially at Heidelberg. Karl Lowenstein was a student of Max Weber. He worked very closely with Max Weber as a student, got to know him very well, and became very much a devotee of the Weberian approach, a very Weberian approach to scholarship. After the First World War, he became a lawyer in Munich, continued with his graduate studies, postgraduate studies, and ultimately became a lecturer in comparative law at the University of Munich. Now it's 1933, however. And Lowenstein is committed in his political life and his intellectual life to a liberal program. He is vehemently and candidly anti-Nazi. So by January 1933, it's no longer viable for him to remain in Munich. He's not going to be able to lecture anymore at the University of Munich. He knows that. He probably won't be able to carry on with his law practice very much longer as somebody of Jewish ancestry. So he starts sending CVs off to America and is hired at Yale on a 3-year contract. He lectures at Yale, meanwhile doing enormous amounts of research and publishing on modern politics. And by 1938, he's the chair in jurisprudence and politics at Amherst. And by the end of the war, or during the war period, he accumulated an enormous impressive record in his studies of Germany, of Nazism, of authoritarianism, and its legal liberalistic antidote. So he's a real expert, right? In his scholarship and his life, Karl Lowenstein was committed to the extension and consolidation of liberal democratic government and universal human rights. To my mind, Lowenstein was close to the model. In Weberian terms, the ideal type liberal scholar. He was learned, he was dogged, he was unsentimental, candid, and above all else, relentlessly a critical thinker about his subject matter. It's also true of Lowenstein that he was, as a person, he was inclined to be superior, overbearing, self-righteous in dealings with others, especially those of inferior intellect and training. And so for all these reasons of intellect and personality, Lowenstein was altogether the wrong sort of person to be working, particularly as a subordinate. And here he is, he's a learned German-speaking scholar, and he's working as a subordinate in an American governmental agency, which is deeply politicized, and it's devoted at the end of the day to national security, all right? But like so many of the best scholars, Lowenstein was something of an idealist. He was vulnerable to the occasional yearning of scholars for his ideas to be relevant and effective. He wanted to return to Germany because he believed fully and without irony or cynicism that he might contribute meaningfully to the American mission in Germany, or at least the means of the mission, the permanent denazification and democratization. And so when he arrived in Berlin in August 1945, Lowenstein was entirely focused on means. Again, denazification, democratization. Then he met his boss. Lowenstein's boss was a man named Charles H. Fahey. Might be some familiar to one or two people here. Fahey was a quintessential New Deal liberal lawyer. He'd come up through the ranks in the National Labor Relations Board, and then was the wartime Solicitor General of the United States, who prosecuted, by the way, for the government of the United States, all of the key constitutional cases involving the Japanese internment issues and other like issues. So just as Lowenstein embodied the archetypal critical scholar, Fahey embodied the New Deal liberal lawyer, and even more so, I believe, the loyal democratic careerist and apparatchik. At the end of the war, Fahey is hoping to get an appointment from Solicitor General to the Attorney Generalship. If failing that, he was hoping to get a Supreme Court of the United States appointment. But he had the bad luck of FDR dying and FDR's patronage network being deeply disturbed by the Truman administration. He didn't get either of the appointments. Fahey didn't get either of the appointments he wanted in the United States. So when he was offered the job of being director of legal division in Berlin in the first phase of the occupation, he decided, though I don't think out of conviction, that he would do that job. Fahey spoke no German. He had no expert knowledge of German law or society. I don't think he'd ever been to Germany before, except perhaps as a soldier during the First World War. He had no direct contact with, or had no capacity to have direct contact with German lawyers or jurists. But he had frequent contact with his boss, General Clay, a military government. He went to Germany, Fahey did, not to carry out the abstract mission of denazification and democratization, but to serve his bosses competently and faithfully by delivering whatever they wanted, whether democratization or democratization light. So then we come to the first major question of the occupation, and particularly within the legal division. How are we going to undertake denazification? Lowenstein had been clear about this in his writings before he arrived in Germany, and he was clear in his memoranda to Fahey and his other bosses right from the beginning. He said, it's absolutely essential that we Americans, with our allies, maintain control over denazification, and that we undertake denazification deliberately and at a slow and sure pace. By no means must we ever devolve denazification back to Germans, even those who are ostensibly anti-Nazi. Because if we do that, it'll only be a matter of time, will be a relatively short period of time when all of the Nazis are rehabilitated. However, General Clay, who was the military governor of Germany at the outset of the occupation, he quickly became convinced, and not without reason, that denazification would be enormously difficult to achieve and greatly inhibit the recovery of German economy and social functioning, that it would aggravate the food crisis, and that it would tend to alienate the German people from the U.S. sphere of influence, security concerns. In the fall of 1945, Clay began to back away from the original conception of denazification and to devolve it back to the Germans, just what Lowenstein thought should not be done. And acting from on his best personal knowledge, and Lowenstein had been sent out to talk to Nazi lawyers and get a sense of how much Nazism had penetrated the German, or the Weimar era German legal system. And Lowenstein concluded that it was fully penetrated by Nazism, and that the justice system had played an important role in supporting Nazi program and goals, and that literally thousands of German legal officials had been compromised morally, professionally by Nazism. So Lowenstein was openly and vehemently opposed to the effective abandonment of the denazification program. Clay then, to General Clay, he decides to get Fahey, who is his lawyer, not only the head of legal division, but is his own lawyer and a good friend. Clay asked Fahey, bring together a policy board on denazification. But it's clear, he said, bring together this board and let's do an investigation of our options, including of maintaining strict control over denazification. But it is clear that he gave the signal to Fahey, as is frequently the case in these situations. I know what the conclusion of your investigation should be. I want you to recommend, after you investigate this, that we devolve denazification back to the Germans. And men like Lowenstein, who were known to dissent from this, weren't even invited to report or to give testimony to this commission. It was a fix. And in the result, the denazification program, including its legal vestiges, was in fact turned over to the Nazis, as Lowenstein had predicted. Thousands of previously influential and unrepentant Nazis were permitted to take up their positions again in the German legal system. And this is within a year of the beginning of the occupation. Now, what I think it's important to note here, too, is that Lowenstein wasn't, at the end of the day, overruled on the basis of Fahey or Clay's better knowledge about Nazism or about the effects of turning denazification back to the Germans. or the best path to democratization. He was overruled because his advice, however informed or principled, only concerned means which no longer squared with national security ends. A few months after he had began at Legal Division, Fahey himself, Lowenstein's boss, he actually gets what he wanted after all, right from the beginning. He got another appointment. Back in the United States, he becomes counsel to the State Department on International Affairs. He's already out of the picture. 6 months into the legal denazification program, Lowenstein is still there. He has a 18-month contract, but he finds himself completely marginalized at this point. No one's reading his memoranda. He's not informing policy. He's not informing policy formation or implementation, even though arguably, probably inarguably, he's the most expert person in the entire division. And it soon dawned, it came to dawn on Lowenstein, much to his disillusionment, that the prevailing dynamic at American military government was to make policies that would tend to bring the German people to the US side against the Soviets. Lowenstein came to conclude that it was not allegiance to democratic nation building, but the shared fear of the Reds that was the glue of US-German policy. The path to national security had been recharted from vigorous denazification to vigorous reconstruction. The job was now not so much to change German politics as to enlist German support against the Soviets. Again, the end was fixed. The means were negotiable. Thank you.
Hello. First, I want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me and all of the participants here today. And thanks for the interesting talk, Rand. I do have a title that doesn't appear in the program. It's called Cold War Social Science, Project Camelot as a Case Study. I recently was at an event and had the chance to talk to a University of Toronto rather distinguished anthropologist. And so I immediately took the opportunity to tell him, oh, I work on the history of social science during the Cold War, maybe it's something of interest to you, and I have this forthcoming edited volume about Cold War social science. And he expressed some interest, and that made me feel happy. And then he told me a couple of anecdotes, which made me realize that actually he did have a serious interest in this. In this matter, which made me happier.
This is your fault, Ron. That's your
sorry
laptop.
about that. Let's see. Yeah, so he told me a few years before there was a job in the anthropology department and they were interviewing candidates and he was one of the faculty members doing the interviews. And one of the questions they asked the candidates was, who was your favorite author, anthropologist, or favorite book or article from the early post-World War II period? I mean, it wasn't from the 1940s or 50s. There was a wide latitude for answering this. And one of the candidates said, can't think of any books or authors. And the faculty members said, oh, really? Nothing comes to mind. And the candidate responded, no, it was just never on any of the reading lists in graduate school. That candidate didn't get the job. And then he also told me that he was, a little disappointed, perhaps not surprised knowing how academia works, but a little disappointed that many of the graduate students in anthropology, I guess today or in recent days, as well as younger faculty members, don't think there's anything worth learning from that generation, the early post-World War II, early Cold War years, because they suspect it's just thoroughly tainted by connections to the Cold War national security state, to funding from the CIA, working with the Defense Department, et cetera. And thus, whatever those scholars had to say, can't be taken seriously or needs to be just thoroughly criticized and thus why even pay any attention to what they actually said? Anyway, this anthropologist thought that was really too bad, and I just mention these anecdotes because it suggests at least the importance of understanding social science during the Cold War, and what I will suggest is thinking about this idea of Cold War social science, first to some still living social scientists today who grew up and remember that era and may have complex views about it, but I think that it's worth knowing just for their own disciplinary histories and the training of new scholars. I mean, and his anecdotes also suggest that the ways in which this period is remembered is also contested. You know, whether there was anything worthwhile done there, whether everything was thoroughly tainted, or maybe there was something more complex that historical scholarship might provide. Okay, so that's my task, right? I'm a historian. In recent scholarship on the history of science and social science, terms such as Cold War science, Cold War anthropology, and Cold War social science have become common. I think this is because these terms resonate with certain points of historical analysis that emphasize the dramatic importance of that era in the evolving partnership between American science, the natural sciences, and the social sciences, and the American state, while also acknowledging deep worries about the character of that partnership. This line of analysis goes something like this. The Cold War marked a new era in world history, and one in which the role of science and science-based technologies, including, of course, weapons technologies, played central roles. Leading social scientists, together with their supporters, often claimed their work had a vital connection to national security and well-being in the Cold War context. But for social scientists to make really effective contributions, established scholarly ways of knowing things had to be reconsidered, even transformed. A variety of professional, financial, and institutional opportunities encourage social scientists to produce the right sort of knowledge for the tasks at hand. Under these conditions, the social sciences underwent dramatic expansion and acquired unprecedented influence. In exchange for working on a variety of topics relevant to Cold War concerns, from population growth to economic development to communist ideology, social scientists received extensive resources and other rewards. At the same time, strong anti-communist pressures, together with a widespread faith in the nation's basic goodness, discouraged social scientists from engaging in research that seemed more than mildly critical of American Cold War policies or their supporting institutions, leaders, and culture. As a result, according to this line of analysis, not only did the social science enterprise become reconfigured, it also became compromised in various ways. To see more specifically how the notion of Cold War social science might be helpful, let's consider the case of Project Camelot, one of the most famous, or infamous, depending upon your views, of the military-sponsored social research projects from the 1960s. According to a description of Project Camelot provided in Army documents from 1964, this study had 3 interrelated goals, and this is the only place I'm actually going to be quoting here. So first, Camelot would devise procedures for assessing the potential for internal war within national societies. Second, this study would identify with increased degrees of confidence those actions which a government might take to relieve conditions which are assessed as giving rise to a potential for internal war. And third, Camelot would assess the feasibility of prescribing the characteristics of a system for obtaining and using the essential information needed for doing the above 2 things. Okay, in sum, this was a social science study about revolutions and how governments like the United States and its allies could implement counterinsurgency measures to suppress them. In stark contrast to Camelot's rather ambitious aims, the project itself had a curiously brief existence. International complaints about the study's imperialistic implications led to its cancellation in mid-1965, before Camelot had even moved beyond the planning stage. Elsewhere, I have argued that Camelot's full importance became manifest only in the following years, as this study became the focal point of an extensive controversy about what I've called the politics-patronage social science nexus. My related goal here today is to explore and assess how the notion of Cold War social science might and might not be helpful for thinking about Project Camelot. Okay, so here's my initial proposal. This is that this notion is helpful, and the main reason is that so many dimensions of Project Camelot's development were, in fact, intimately related to the Cold War. Thus, this study did not merely happen to arise during the Cold War era, right? I mean, if we talk about Cold War social science, presumably we're not talking about just social science that happened to take place in 1952 or 62 or whatever it is, right? I mean, there's some, by putting the Cold War before the social science, we're suggesting there was some sort of deep connection between the two, as I've sketched above. So in many ways, I think Camelot was a creature of the Cold War. So let me just sketch some of these briefly. So to begin with, the project's origins were rooted in the changing geopolitical dimensions of the Cold War during the 1950s and early 1960s. American foreign policy initiatives during these years increasingly focused on the so-called developing world, by then a central arena of concern as the opposing superpowers in the Cold War struggle sought to forge favorable relations with dozens of emerging new nations recently freed from colonial rule. As the superpowers pursued access to their valuable natural resources and strategic sites, and as they tried to cultivate the support from their rapidly growing populations. At the same time, the Soviet Union and Communist China declared their support for anti-Yankee, anti-American revolutions. Project Camelot arose out of this changing geopolitical context. Its expected cost of $6 million, that was $6 million back then, I don't know, you can multiply that in a few times to, well, I don't know, 6 times, 7 times to give the current day equivalent, made it an unusually large project. And one scholar even claimed it would, or would have, had it not been canceled, served as the Manhattan Project for the social sciences. Yet military support of this sort of social research expanded rapidly during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And in this sense, Camelot was characteristic of scholarship launched during that era to support the nation's evolving interest in the developing world. In addition, and as my comments above have already suggested, Camelot's institutional foundations and financial support linked it firmly to the Defense Department's growing commitment to the social sciences, in this case through SORO, or the Special Operations Research Office. As the nation's activities in the developing world grew, the Army's responsibilities expanded to include participation in nation-building projects and counterinsurgency initiatives. Created by the Army in 1956 and located on the campus of American University in Washington, D.C., SORO quickly became the Army's main center for contract research in the behavioral sciences. SORONs, as SORO's personnel playfully refer to themselves, produced handbooks on countries around the world that provided information on political, economic, and social structures, as well as revolutionary potential. SORO also established a counterinsurgency information analysis center, and after a few years, SORO was conducting field studies in foreign areas. So SORO's plans for Project Camelot developed quite naturally within this particular Cold War conditioned military, institutional, and funding environments. Furthermore, when we turn to the project's research organization, its intellectual framework, and its mixing of policy relevance and scholarly goals, Camelot also seems like a quintessential Cold War creature. Social science supporting the nation's expanding and changing national security interests was often expensive. It involved teams of scholars, and it involved interdisciplinary coordination. These dimensions of this research suggested the rather obvious inadequacy of traditional academic social science research, with its standard disciplinary orientation, departmental boundaries, small scale, and meager funding. During the Cold War, the military and other national security agents developed an extensive system of new research organizations. These relied heavily on university scholars, but they also placed scholars in new settings with new funding and other incentives aimed at producing knowledge with both policy and scholarly relevance. In the case of Project Camelot, the planning documents themselves, the planning process itself, drew on the expertise of a few dozen scholars, including many from prestigious universities such as MIT, Princeton, and Stanford, but there's a long list. And they came from various disciplinary backgrounds, from sociology to political science to anthropology, just to name a few of the major ones. And though Camelot certainly promised to produce policy-relevant knowledge, it also allowed scholars to pursue work that they would value and their colleagues would value in more academically oriented settings. In fact, the study was even characterized as basic research, although categorizing as such was some people contested that classification, and the study itself wasn't even classified. Regarding its intellectual framework more specifically, the Camelot's planning documents also emphasize its commitment to systems analysis and to predictive model building, modeling revolutionary systems and identifying the points where you might intervene to alter the outcome. That's the basic idea. And this, systems analysis and predictive model building were both commonly found in many areas of national security-oriented social science and other scientific research during those years. But I also want to suggest that the notion of Cold War social science is limiting precisely because it suggests an all-encompassing integration in which social science seems to be entirely subsumed and thoroughly transformed by its Cold War environment. Now, undoubtedly, large areas of the social sciences interacted with and were in the process shaped by Cold War politics, institutions, ideology, and so forth. But can the researchers, their projects, their theories, their methods, their ideas, can they all be reduced so that we understand them as simply and fully Cold War reflections, Cold War props, Cold War agents, or Cold War victims? Such an interpretation, I think, has limits even in the case of Project Camelot. Let me mention two of these limitations. So one limitation concerns the relevance of other time frames and the significance of issues that cannot be reduced to their Cold War meaning. I think obviously scholarly and political interests in development, in revolution, and the role of America in world history certainly predated the Cold War, and they've continued to be prominent ever since the Cold War ended, whenever you think it ended. How social scientists engaged with such topics at the time surely reflected the particular conditions of their era in significant ways, but their work should also be viewed in the context of longer discussions and wider debates about the nature of historical change, the prospects of historical progress, and the ability of people and governments to direct changes along desired paths. A second limitation concerns the complexities of the social sciences and their links to the Cold War. Within the social sciences, within the national security state, and within military-funded social research organizations such as SURO or the RAND Corporation, there was often room for at least some, and often quite significant, disagreement about basic matters concerning America's Cold War interest and policies. And the relevance of the social sciences to those. So a few questions that animated debate at the time. Did the US need more nuclear weapons? Or maybe better conventional forces? Or maybe greater counterinsurgency capabilities? Or perhaps some mix, but what was the relevant mix and why, right? Another question, was it possible and desirable to create, as Bernard Brody, a political scientist at the time, called it, a science of strategy that would be used to replace the wisdom, presumably outdated wisdom, and overbearing influence of the military generals? Another question, were the behavioral sciences cutting edge, or were they simply faddish? Were revolutionary movements led by rational agents, or by emotionally troubled individuals? Well, these and many other questions were certainly informed by Cold War concerns, informed by and spoke to Cold War concerns, developments, and policies, but pointing this out is only one important part of a fuller analysis that explores the complexities, the tensions, and the debates that animated social science work of that period. Okay, so to conclude, I've suggested that the notion of Cold War social science helps us analyze and understand the relationship between the Cold War and the social sciences, and I've discussed Project Camelot as a striking illustration of how certain areas of the social sciences were embedded in the Cold War context at many significant levels. But I think even in the case of Project Camelot, other relevant timeframes and complexities also require us to pursue lines of analysis that move beyond the all-encompassing integration associated with the notion Cold War social science. Thank you.
I'm going to sit this way. I can see the slides.
We really didn't lose our panel. It's terrific to be here with all of you today, and somehow we are one ahead of where I wanted to be right in this moment. Historians, I think, can come to events like this as storytellers, and what might be the best kinds of stories that we can tell, particularly about the natural sciences in the United States during the Cold War period. Even if we're not necessarily drawing direct lessons, what are the things that we might want to keep in mind? What are the developments that can help us understand some of the tensions, issues that are emerging now in the post-9/11 era? And there are any number of questions one could raise. I've nominated what I think may be some of the more interesting ones to discuss here, relating both to what was special, distinct about the university in the Cold War era in the United States. How did these changes that occurred in American universities shape the kind of knowledge that was being produced? What happened as secrecy became a major facet of university programs? And finally, what happened once scientists became more and more bound in with foreign policy and larger national security implications? I suspect that part of the story is already rather familiar to many of you. The government on state levels, national levels, had been involved in institutions of higher education for a long time. Many will remember the Morrill Land Grant Act already in the Civil War era, 1862, which helped underwrite new colleges that would teach emerging understanding in agriculture and related fields. Those were not the only centers for producing knowledge on the landscape. If one looked around already by the beginning of the 20th century, one saw evidence of Thomas Edison's leading invention. Some say the research laboratories where many of the researchers produced at the universities were going for employment. Even more crucial, by the 1920s and into the 1930s, the major foundations began to sponsor research, particularly at universities, built new institutions and facilities for researchers to work at. Not only the Carnegie, but the Rockefeller Foundations, the General Education Board within the United States, began to pump in large amounts of money, particularly for the natural sciences. This is a photograph of Warren Weaver, one of the architects, but one of his other colleagues said that the job of the foundations is to make the peaks higher. What did he mean? Take the science that's being done, give more resources to the scientists to pursue the questions that they were interested in addressing. We have just a few moments. You know, I think, that short story, the profound story of the change that comes in World War II, development of radar, the atomic bomb, the use of government contracts to stimulate work at universities for projects of immediate concern to the state. These photographs coming from the MIT Rad Lab operation, the amount of funding, which we'll talk about in a moment, absolutely extraordinary. By the 1940s and into the Cold War period, these were the dominant patrons for many fields of the natural sciences, not all fields, but many of the fields, including the AEC, the various branches of the new Consolidated Department of Defense. If this is unfamiliar, particularly for some of the younger people in the audience, if the mall doesn't look like that in the moment, these were the temporary structures set up in large part to house scientific facilities during the war years. And many of those agencies and government facilities became permanent structures in the Cold War itself. I think the question of how knowledge gets produced, what changes in the Cold War period, may be the one that has the greatest relevance for our panel here. And I realize it's just before coffee break, but if I can invite you to focus in on this line that increases from 1935 up to 1945 and then continues an increase. It looks steep enough, doesn't it? But this is a logarithmic graph. That's what makes this one graph so powerful. That's the amount of military patronage that begins to pour into the natural sciences. This is one of the most distinct features of the natural sciences in the Cold War period. How does it influence research? This is a document I was able to get declassified from the National Archives a while ago, and it's a secret letter at the document at the time describing certain fields along with their implications, why it matters for national security. There's some interesting ones on there. If you look under meteorology, you see that in all seriousness, there is a discussion going on about controlling the weather, a major area of interest in parts of the newly emerging Pentagon at this time. What I'd invite you to consider is that this is an intellectual map created in the Cold War of the environmental sciences, the physical branches, at least, of the environmental sciences, for what's missing from this list of what matters. It's the biological sciences. We think today of the environmental sciences encompassing both branches, the physical and the biological, but during this period of time, it was the physical branches that were of greatest concern to the national military establishment. Why? Because if you were launching a guided missile, if you were managing submarine or anti-submarine warfare, you needed to know the water column and its properties, the atmosphere. You needed to know where gravity was more intense so that you could guide the missile to its intended target. You didn't need to know quite that same kind of broad-based knowledge from the biological branches of the environmental sciences, but it's still knowledge that had relevance to many research programs today. All of you will have heard of plate tectonics that came out in large part because of the amount of money that came into research in the earth sciences. Climate change was also being discussed in the Pentagon. When, might you ask? First evidence for it, 1947, secret debate. What's the concern? It seems to be getting warmer at the poles. That's going to mean that the Soviet harbors are going to be ice-free for much longer. The Soviet agricultural season is going to be longer. Citizens will be healthier. The Soviets will have a stronger armed forces. The physical parts of the environmental sciences gained enormously during this period of time. And I'd call your attention to one other interesting development in the production of knowledge. There was so much money flowing in to universities that sometimes it swamped the academic departments and required these new research centers to be separate entities, sometimes physically separate from the campuses to which they were connected, like the Applied Physics Lab or the Earth Science facility at Columbia University. It mixed up the disciplines. It made things inherently interdisciplinary in ways that had not been possible with pre-war patronage and the levels of pre-war patronage. Two last points I'd like to consider. Matters of secrecy. I know that some of the panelists later are going to get to the question and the very important role that media, the newspapers in the Cold War era, played in getting information, stories out to the American public concerning activities of the state, secret relationships. And I think it's what makes this letter from the publisher of the New York Times back in 1946 so extraordinary. It was an exchange between him and Vannevar Bush, who was the czar, the person who was helping to run at highest levels of the U.S. state science programs during World War II and continued in that role. And Bush asked Sulzberger to keep quiet at the New York Times about certain key developments. Sulzberger was not happy, but largely complied. This was the case for at least 15 more years, when the New York Times broke the story of a test of a nuclear weapon very high above the Pacific Ocean in 1962. At that point, all bets were off. Secrecy became a topic of deep discussion. It concerned scientists at universities who found that the security agreements they signed did not allow them to talk about many areas of research with their colleagues. Particularly, the physical environmental scientists could not talk to their biological colleagues who did not have clearance. These problems were widely recognized. Congress at times took up this matter, and it's quite interesting that the Washington Post, then under the direction of Phil Graham, made a point of calling attention to what he called the cult of secrecy. And this is back, it's hard to read, this is 1956, talking about the damage being done to the U.S. national security by the intense secrecy that had become very much common and welcomed in certain parts of Washington, D.C. And those hearings were held back in the 50s by John Moss, whose name may not be as memorable as perhaps it deserves to be, because this whole question of secrecy is what inspired Moss a few years later to introduce the legislation that became the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, that allows for increasing amounts of information to come from the state once people begin to petition for it. And finally, one of the issues that I think does help define something different and new in the Cold War period were the new limits that came to scientists acting internationally as science became increasingly crucial and important to national security and to the state on the whole. Scientists have been famous for wanting to be international. It's clear that many of them deeply believed in international issues. They also had another pragmatic reason, which is that they did their best work if they understood what their competitors, no matter where they were located, what they were doing. They wanted international contacts. They found in the Cold War it was becoming increasingly difficult to do that, in stark contrast to the 1920s and 1930s. This was just one meeting of the National Security Council where science issues were front and center. There's Harry Truman in the lead chair. What makes this story of the universities and science in the Cold War so interesting is the competing pressures that were in place. The State Department wanted scientists to stop being international to support U.S. foreign policy. the CIA wanted them to continue their contacts because that was going to provide intelligence that would be useful for the US state. And there were major fights that were kept quiet, kept secret at the very highest levels of government. The very end of the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower himself was leading a discussion at the National Security Council that pitted Wallace Brode, who was the science advisor at State, with George Kiski-Akowski, one of the major advisors to the White House. Kiski-Akowski argued that it was in U.S. national security interest to stay involved in international science, had some very interesting lines about how it was going to aid Eastern Europe achieve independence from the Soviet bloc more quickly than it otherwise would happen. It was a debate that Eisenhower helped resolve in favor of scientific internationalism, but I think what's interesting is that that debate occurred at all. It had reflected those new tensions in the Cold War about what it meant to be a scientist and citizen, and the role and the relationship of the scientist to the state. It was in flux, it was changing, the competing roles caused problems. I'll pause just long enough to point out that this fellow here was the first director of science within the CIA. It was extraordinarily difficult to try to conceal his role through some very interesting subterfuge and blind assignments, cover assignments for him. I'm going to end with this one slide to bring us up into the 9/11 period and post 9/11 period. Judith Reppe at Cornell University was doing some very interesting work in the aftermath of 9/11 in interviewing Homeland Security officials and people in the biological community, and came away with that quote. I just happened to search by the term owned, but perhaps it's useful that it's highlighted. And you can read the implication there, going back to the atomic bomb and the physics community, to something that had changed and may be changing in our own period now. What stories do we want to continue to tell? I can simply remind all of you that many of the institutions created in the Cold War period are still with us, unlike what happened after World War I, when many of those new links between science and the state were dismantled. I think that question that's up here about what that relationship is going to be, particularly as international corporations and funding issues and patronage are back very much in the picture again, all remains to be seen. Did something fundamental change in the Cold War? I'd say the answer is yes. What the full implications are, the next generation of historians will be the ones to answer that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists here. And, when we started this the panel, I said that one of the things I thought would come up here was the way in which the Cold War structured the production of knowledge. And actually, listening to the papers, I think really the issue here, and maybe something we'd like to talk about in the time that we have remaining, is how the Cold War has how it ultimately threatened independent thinking, which is what I think a university is supposed to be about. After all, the whole notion of tenure is predicated on the idea that this is what we're trying to preserve here in a educational institution like a university, the idea that we can think independently. So one thing I thought was missing from all the stories that you told this morning was sort of resistance to this. And I could see, obviously, that this represented, as Ron said, the Cold War, a watershed in undermining independent thought in the university. But there must have been some people that were speaking out, were trying to protest and oppose this kind of trend. So,
if you don't mind, I'll speak to that, because Carl Lowenstein, once he returned, somewhat reluctantly, even though he'd been deeply disillusioned by his experience in American military government, he returned to his post at Amherst, and no longer beholden to the American government, he began to write editorials, write letters to the editor and editorials in the major newspapers in the United States. And the theme of those letters was that denazification was being betrayed, and it was being undermined, and that this was putting at risk the potential democratization of Germany under American military occupation, putting aside the moral implications of letting the Nazis off the hook. So there was resistance.
So your question is, were people resisting the limitations on the production of knowledge imposed by national security pressures during the Cold War?
I mean, I see the university
Yeah.
as an institution. It's different from a corporation, for example, right? I mean, this is an institution set up,
Yeah.
organized around independent thought, and here you have.
And I assume you're talking about probably the very early Cold War, right? Because I mean, because certainly by the mid 1960s there was lots of resistance, right? I mean, by faculty. Yeah. So there was some resistance, and there were actually some books, and I'm sure more articles and editorials, but at least some books written by social scientists in the very early 1950s. There were actually a couple published by sociologists at Columbia University, including Paul Lazarsfeld, and another by Robert McGovern, about the threats to academic freedom during the McCarthy era. And they were critical, saying that there were real threats. I mean, they tried to make a sophisticated analysis, but they were able to publish a couple of books. They were also hounded by anti-communists for being subversive.
All that I'd like to add is that so often when we think about the Cold War, we think about it as a story about physicists. And they are absolutely crucial players in that story, but focusing just on the one discipline can blind us to some very interesting differences in general responses by different disciplines. For instance, when the CIA began to recruit who would actually run the Office of Scientific Intelligence, they rather successfully recruited from the field of chemistry. And if one thinks about how many people in the chemical field are working in industry and knew a lot about safeguarding secrets, one realizes that within that larger discipline and profession, there were different perceptions of the Cold War and what it meant than in the physics community, whose story I think we understand better. One quick point, the president of the American Chemical Society in 1954 went on record in saying that any chemist who was a member of the Communist Party had betrayed his allegiance to the field of chemistry and would not be able to be a full member of the American Chemical Society. You can't imagine that kind of sentiment from the physicists. We have to be thinking about these different fields and their different stories.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was just wondering, during the Cold War period, there was at one point a backlash to the Cold War university on the part of the student body from many universities. There was ROTC buildings that got blown up. In fact, one got blown up right here on this campus, right where the University Circle police station is. There were protests against complicity with the military, which you so amply highlighted. there was also anti-Vietnam War protests to the point where there was confrontations with the National Guard. 4 Kent State students got killed in one of those confrontations. So my question is do you see a point where there might be a backlash to the anti-terror university, which has arisen in the 21st century?
Gentlemen? Would anyone like to speak to that?
One example that comes to mind along those lines of answering your final question is the derision, at least limited derision, that was directed towards John Yoo at Berkeley, who had written the memoranda supporting torture. And I understand that Condoleezza Rice faced at least some discomforting moments at Stanford when she joined the Hoover Institution. So those are, I mean, small-scale examples of some resistance to the actions of academics, who became political actors and then returned to the university. But I don't know if there's anything like a widespread phenomenon of this yet.
I'm talking about in the future.
I need my crystal ball. It's not working today. I mean, certainly knowledge produced for the national security state and the war on terror certainly involves universities in very significant ways. I wonder though if, but universities to me look pretty much the same today. I mean, in the sense that if you look at how they looked 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I mean, they even physically look the same. I don't know, maybe there's a new course or program of study over here, but I think one of the things that happened in the 1960s, there had been so much dramatic change, and there were so many people going off and, being to Vietnam that, I don't know, somehow the relations with the national security state seemed to me much more open to question at that time because so much had changed so recently. And I mean, I hate to be pessimistic, but about the degree of resistance and opposition. But I just think on campuses, I mean, most students and most graduate students aren't experiencing a very different environment today than pre 9/11. I just don't think their experiences.
Though of the, as you said, facility that's set apart from the rest of the campus for production of biological agents, and this is the new wave when you're going through the different disciplines in the hard sciences, and a lot of resistance to the study of different viruses, biological agents, and the possibility that some of them might be weaponized, and a lot of reaction against that.
Yeah, there's a question over here. You want to use the microphone so that the Pentagon can hear you?
I have a question for Randy Kostal, but in the meantime, the historian in me is a little bit upset by the conflation of the early 50s and the late 60s. I mean, the number of people like Chandler Davis, mathematician, who went to prison rather than buckle in front of House committees is minuscule, and whether we do see some uprising in the next 10 or 15 years probably has more to do with things that haven't happened yet than with any reservoir of courage. But my question to Randy Kostal, there are two prevailing views of denazification in...
Denazification or Nazification?
Of denazification, right. I'm sorry, in German academia. One says that, at least in part in obeisance to the United States and the imperatives of the Cold War, the purge of Nazi elites ceases, and that's one problem that lays the groundwork for the '68 rebellions, and that West Germany only after the student uprisings of 1968 really becomes liberal democracy. And that's a very compelling narrative. The alternative narrative, which used to be the proper, and it seems to be the one with which you would be likely to identify, the competing narrative that used to be the property of conservatives, but after Iraq and after the Ba'ath regime seems to have a little bit more persuasive power, is that if you purge that many people who are at the core of the state, you kick out the possible foundations, you destroy the foundations for the stability that might or might not produce a liberal democratic society. So that unless you choose the East German route, which sacrifices different sets of rights and freedoms in order to pursue retribution against Nazis, that unless you do that, but if you stick within the realm of what's possible in capitalist liberal democracies, that an excessive commitment, which we would praise individuals, Lowenstein and others, for, is nevertheless politically dysfunctional, and the lesson of the Baathists in Iraq and the fruits of the hardline purge policy is a tale we might want to take into account when evaluating the two stories of denazification.
I think that in my brief remarks, I'm undoubtedly oversimplified Lowenstein's view. He actually had a very subtle view, I think, of denazification. He didn't think, by the way, that a comprehensive purge was either possible or desirable. But he did think that the Americans and their allies, particularly the Western ones, he didn't have very much confidence that the Soviets would participate, but he believed that the Americans and the Allies should undertake a slow, deliberate, and selective purge, particularly in the legal field. And it would take, he thought it was going to take some time to do right, but it was fundamentally important, least of all for moral reasons. Even though he was of Jewish ancestry, he wasn't really talking mainly about retributive justice. He was mainly thinking about what's going to work in terms of ensuring the consolidation of liberal democratic norms in the German legal and political system. He said a selective purge is what we need. But in order to achieve one, we cannot, early in the day, give back the process. For pragmatic and political reasons, give back the process to Germans. In the very first year, it won't work. It only will lead to mass rehabilitation and almost immediate rehabilitation of every card-carrying Nazi, which was virtually everybody, but including the ideologically committed and culpable Nazis. They'll all be let back into the system, just as we are trying to make crucially important, delicate democratic adjustments to that system. They will undermine it. They're anti-democratic, they're anti-liberal. We can't allow them en masse to return. So I think that Lowenstein had a subtle view. What he was critical of was the unsubtle approach, unsubtly pragmatic approach of the political masters in the military government, who said, we can't do this job at all, so we won't even try. We won't even try a selective process. We'll give it back to the Germans, and we'll hope that they will do it right. That was certainly just a hope. There wasn't much likelihood that at all that the Germans were going to do the job well at all.
We're a minute. Can we go? One more question. Actually, I saw, if you don't mind, you using the microphone. At least those are my instructions. It's doing what I'm told.
So I guess this is a question for Ronald. Raymond Siever, an earth scientist at Harvard, has a fascinating piece where he talks about a kind of bifurcation in the Cold War earth science community between those with clearances and defense funding and those without. And so those with the clearances and the funding spent their summers on these lavish Pentagon-funded trips, and the others didn't. And those with the clearances knew things about the physical structure of the Earth that those without were not allowed to know. And the most spectacular example is that there'd been undersea mapping funded by the Pentagon, and it was funded on condition that when the maps were published in the open literature, they would deliberately be plotted incorrectly, so that the public would not know the true nature of the maps. And so you had to have a clearance to know how to correct the deliberately mistaken literature in the open literature, right? And at MIT, you have something similar at Draper, where Draper had a clearance, and students who had clearances could work in certain buildings at MIT, which others couldn't work at. So I wonder if you could speak to the way the presence of defense work on campus sort of bifurcated what ought to be an open, unitary community of knowledge and created a special elite that had access to information that other people didn't have access to. There are obvious implications for foreign-born scholars and what tensions that produced.
Hugh, you've set that up so well that I think, given the interest of time, just to say what the points that you made, and particularly in quoting Ray Seaver, are, as you say, there was a bifurcation, there was a divisions that occurred. How many of you, just out of curiosity, remember seeing at one point that beautiful map that National Geographic produced of the floor of the ocean showing the mountains? It came out during the Cold War period. The reason I'm asking you about that, I'm sorry I didn't have it in the presentation, is that you could draw what's called a physiographic map, just showing the outlines of the undersea features, because those were declassified, whereas the exact soundings which mattered for where you were going to hide a submarine were classified. So how information got communicated indeed was structured by Cold War restrictions.
I'm afraid we have to end there and reconvene and
Yeah, they came together.
pardon me, reconvene at 11 o'clock. Thank you.